Trump has selected Steven Mnuchin, his campaign national finance chairman, as Treasury Secretary, and Wilbur Ross, his campaign economic advisor, as Commerce Secretary. They both join me right now live. Gentlemen, good to see you. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Really, big day. Before we get to the specifics of each of your roles, how do you see yourself working together? It seems to me that Commerce and Treasury, key roles in terms of economic growth. How do you see yourself working together?
Same way we did during the campaign. We were very much a team during the campaign, and we've known each other for quite a few years, so this is nothing new. Working together is going to be one of the hallmarks of this administration.
Absolutely. We're going to have an integrated plan and work closely between Commerce and Treasury to make sure that we drive growth in this country. Our #1 priority is sustained 3 to 4% GDP.
3 to 4% GDP is almost double what we're seeing right now. And of course, how do you get there is the question in terms of growth. When would you expect 3 to 4 economic growth?
You know, I think this is something over the next couple of years we're going to get to, and I think it's very achievable. I mean, this has been an administration for the last 8 years where we haven't had enough growth. Our #1 priority is going to be tax reform. We think that by lowering the corporate tax rate, we're going to make U.S. corporations incredibly competitive and create enormous amounts of money that comes back onshore and creates jobs.
Let's talk about how you do that, Steven, because obviously you followed Trump throughout the entire campaign process. In terms of your first steps during this transition period and first steps in January, how do you get that tax reform moving?
Well, the good thing about this is Wilbur and I have worked together on the economic plan with the president-elect throughout the campaign. We were integral to both economic speeches, the one in Detroit as well as the one in New York. And we have a plan. We've been working with the policy group. We're already sitting down and discussing this with Congress. And this is going to be something that happens absolutely within the first 90 days of this presidency. We're going to have a major tax reform, biggest tax reform since Reagan. And it's not just going to be a cut in corporate taxes, but it's also going to be a very large middle-income tax cut that's going to help this country.
That's what I want to ask you about. I'm going to save that for in a moment. I want to ask you about this idea that corporate taxes go to 15%. What happens to individual taxes? Because there was some debate that maybe he would deal with individual taxes later, so we'll get to that. But Wilbur, let me ask you about steel tariffs that you've dealt with in your private life in running your business, and the idea that people are worried about potential tariffs actually being a disruptor for economic growth. How do you see tariffs and trade changing?
Well, trade is the important thing to change, and tariffs are one potential ultimate tool. But really, they're, for the most part, a negotiating tool to get the countries to relieve the tariff and non-tariff barriers to our trade. The real objective is to build our exports, not so much to kill the imports. That's a total mischaracterization of what's being done. Now, if need be, there will be tariffs, and there'll be especially tariffs for punitive purposes for people who dump.
Characterize that for us, because I don't know that most people understand Chinese dumping, for example, and the idea that American companies have to compete with products coming from China that are much cheaper.
Yes, and they're cheaper partly because they're being sold at a loss. 1/3 of all the state-owned enterprises in China have never made a profit. 1/3.
Wow.
And that's a huge slug, about half of their entire economy. Because China is really about jobs. It's not so much about corporate profit. That's one thing that people don't really quite get. And for example, steel, as you know, an industry I know quite a little bit about.
Exactly.
They have 1 billion tons of steel capacity. They need about 700 million themselves. They've been selling overseas about 100 million tons, mostly at very aggressively low prices, and they still have 200 million tons idle. That's a horrible combination. That needs to get fixed.
So how do you fix it?
They're already starting to fix it. For the first time, I was just over there a few weeks ago, then for the first time there's a real program for the federal government, the localities, to get together with new investors to take care of the people who will be dislocated by consolidation within their industry.
Okay. And Wilbur, Commerce Secretary obviously is a liaison between companies and the White House. You'll be on the front lines dealing with companies all over the world.
Well, I've spent my life doing that.
Yes, you have. So what are you hearing from companies today in terms of what they'd like to see?
Well, judging from the emails so far, they're as enthused as can be about Stephen and myself.
Yeah.
They know us. They've dealt with us before. They have a pretty good idea what they can expect, and they can't wait.
Stephen, if it's one thing that you hear from managers of businesses and CEOs over and over again, it's the fact that our tax plan is the most unfavorable in the industrialized world, the highest taxes in the industrialized world. Talk to us. You said in the first 90 days you're going to have tax reform. Walk us through it.
Sure. So this is going to be a major priority, and there's two aspects of it. One, as I mentioned, is corporate taxes, and the other is personal income taxes. And we're going to simplify the personal income tax, lower from 7 brackets down to 3, simplify it, deliver a very significant middle-income tax cut that's going to be combined with the child care program. And the other aspect of it is on the upper end, we'll cut the tax rate, but it will be offset with a significant reduction of deductions. So for the upper class, it won't be a tax cut, but it will be a simplification. It will lower the marginal rate, which will spur investment.
You say it will spur investment because you have to assume that with a better situation on earnings, because companies are paying less in tax, they will reinvest that money in their business and hire.
Absolutely. We fundamentally believe in dynamic scoring of taxes, and this is something we're going to be working with Congress and passing legislation.
It's a similar plan to what we heard out of the House, Paul Ryan's plan. Do you think they will go for 15%, or do you think maybe it will be a little higher than that once all gets said and done and it passes through Congress?
Well, we're committed. We think 15% is the right tax rate. It has a lot of similarities to the House GOP plan. There are certain aspects that are different, so the Trump tax plan is slightly different. And, we'll work with Congress to get this done. We couldn't be more excited about it being a major priority and a major part of creating growth in this country.
Look, you've been a business guy for a long time, and we've talked about this for a long time. Why has it been so difficult to get tax reform through already?
Well, I'd say there's two aspects. There's tax reform and there's regulatory reform, and those are the two things that we hear. But I think as it relates to taxes, I think people understand we have to simplify the system and make the United States competitive, and that's going to be our priority.
Well, I guess people didn't want to do it, right? I mean, you heard Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail calling it trumped up, trickle down economics. So how do you push back on that Hillary said, look, just because you're making a favorable environment for business doesn't ensure that they're going to invest in their businesses and hire new workers? What's the pushback?
Well, let me first say, Clinton had very different policies than Trump, and I think we see where the country is. Okay. The second thing is, we have an administration that's going to listen. So sometimes we'll agree with business and sometimes we won't, but we're absolutely committed to listen. And if you look at this, we have a president and a vice president-elect who picked up the phone and called the CEO of United Technologies and said, we want you to keep jobs in this country. And our priority is going to be creating good jobs for the American worker. For the last 15 years, the American worker has gone nowhere. And this administration is about putting them back to work and creating good jobs.
I think you make a great point. And I think that you probably are going to see real impact here. You're hearing it from companies. To hear Apple considering doing a plant here in America to build the iPhone, to hear obviously the changes in carrier. But then there's trade, Wilbur, and a lot of people are worrying that Donald Trump is pulling out of TPP. We had Nicholas Burns on the show earlier this morning, and he said, look, this is 40% of global GDP. We need to do the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
It's not going to happen.
Why?
Because it's a flawed agreement. For example, it's fine to say that it's a multi-country agreement. Theoretically, that means you're erecting big trade barriers against people outside that agreement. But the reality is, under TPP, the majority of the content of a car could come from outside TPP, say from China or Indonesia or Malaysia or anywhere, yet get total TPP tax treatment, and if it came in through Mexico, total NAFTA tax treatment as well. That's a silly treaty.
Mm-hmm. So will you want to redo it in another form with the same countries involved?
Well, the president has said, and we agree, that it's much easier and much more sensible to try to do bilateral negotiations, because the problem with getting 15 or 20 countries together, you have to make a certain concession to country number one. Now you're dealing with country number two. That wants another concession. Country number three wants another one. And meanwhile, you lose track of the fact we are the biggest market. We are the biggest customer. They should be thinking of themselves as valued suppliers to their main customer, not as little piranha fish picking away at the main customer.
What is the most important bilateral deal you think you need to do?
Well, I think there are going to be lots of them. The NAFTA is probably as good a starting point as any. NAFTA is technically 3 countries, but there are a lot of issues that we have that will benefit us and will also benefit both Mexico and Canada.
I want to get back to NAFTA, Wilbur. This is an important point that you raised, and I want to talk about it. But first, Stephen, let me read you the statement from the Democratic National Committee this morning. And they say, so much for draining the swamp. Nominating Stephen Mnuchin to be Treasury Secretary, a billionaire hedge fund manager and Goldman Sachs alumnus who preyed on homeowners struggling during the recession, is a slap in the face to voters who hoped he would shake up Washington. Trump is already heading into office as the most corrupt, conflicted, and unpopular president-elect in history, and now he's breaking his signature promise to the voters who elected him. And this is from DNC Communications Director Adam Hodge. Your reaction?
Well, first let me say I was surprised to see that statement. As it relates to Goldman Sachs, I had a terrific career there. I haven't been there since 2002. I spent most of the last 8 years as a regional banker understanding what this country needs in terms of regional banks and working with banks. And although we control the House and the Senate, it'll be my job to work with the Democrats as well in making sure that we work together as a team in getting things passed.
So let's talk about the rollback of regulations, which is so powerful. What regulations out there do you think are most onerous that you really do need to take a second and third look at?
Well, the first thing we're going to do is look at Dodd-Frank, and it is way, way, way too complicated, and there's many aspects of it that we got to kill. There's many aspects of it that prevent banks from lending, and we need to make sure that banks lend. We want to see huge growth in this economy. It's small and medium-sized businesses, and we need to make sure that the banks are lending to them. So
the rules had become so stringent that the banks pulled back, and they were lending less. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the rules are so complicated that many times banks don't even know how to interpret many of the rules. So let me just say, you know, I believe we need to have proper regulation of banks that have FDIC deposits to make sure that we keep the safety of FDIC deposits. But having said that, there's many, many aspects of Dodd-Frank that cross over so many things that make no sense that we're going to look at.
Well, you probably experienced this as well, Will.
Well, I did in the banks that we have.
Yeah.
The average small bank now has more compliance people than lending officers. That's a very flawed business model.
And even at the large banks, the regulators have offices there, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's not the way to run a bank. Government is not the right way to allocate capital. Private sector is the right way. Look at Fannie and Freddie, the 2 things that government had the most influence on. They're not exactly role models.
Would you move to change Fannie and Freddie at this point? Would you move to have these privatized?
Absolutely. We got to get Fannie and Freddie out of government ownership. It makes no sense that these are owned by the government and have been controlled by the government for as long as they have. In many cases, this displaces private lending in the mortgage markets, and we need these entities that will be safe. So let me just be clear. We'll make sure that when they're restructured, they're absolutely safe and they don't get taken over again, but we got to get them out of government control.
This is a big deal. These are huge institutions. You think that, I mean, if we saw that as not complicated, wouldn't that have happened already, that it would get out of government?
Well, I think this administration, it hasn't been a priority. If it had been a priority, it would have. And our administration is right up there on the top 10 list of things that we're going to get done, and we'll get it done reasonably fast.
Talk to me about the first couple of months as Commerce Secretary.
Right.
Wilbur, what will be your priorities?
Well, first we have to get a staff together because you can't implement anything without a staff. Second, we're going to go in a scheduled way through the trade agreements, through the ones that we do have trade agreements with and ones we do not. Because we're not anti-trade agreement. It just, as I say, we're anti-ones that don't make sense. So there's need to fix the old ones. There's a need to enter into some new ones.
So tell me about NAFTA. What do you want to change about NAFTA?
Well, I think the right way to negotiate NAFTA is in conference rooms with Mexico and Canada, not, frankly, in the press room.
Yeah, okay. No, that's a fair point. But, you know, a lot of people worry, business in particular, that if we're going to see, you know, pulling out of TPP, looking at NAFTA, changing NAFTA, looking at anything else that may not make sense, is it too much at once? Will it create disruption as opposed to growth?
Well, first of all, it isn't a question of pulling out of TPP. TPP
Right.
does not exist.
Right.
It's a fiction of people's imagination at this point.
Well, Obama wanted it to push it until the last days in office.
Well,
come on.
it was especially a figment of his imagination.
Right. So that's the question, though, in terms of disruption, too much at once. What do you say to that?
No, but my point is, it's hard to say there's disruption when you don't do something you weren't doing anyway.
What about NAFTA?
NAFTA needs to be fixed, but it's not going to be fixed with blowing up the whole world. Mexico's not going to go to zero. Canada's certainly not going to go to zero. But there are changes needed, and I think the markets are recognizing it. Look how the peso has acted. If that doesn't tell you that everybody knows there'll be change, I don't know what does.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when you look at, for example, the UK, it feels like Theresa May has reached out. Is that an important trading partner for the U.S.?
It's a potentially very important one. And we have always had a very special relationship with the UK as a country. I have always had a special relationship with UK as an individual, both from investing point of view, from a social point of view, and from every other point of view.
Yeah.
So I think that will be a very interesting new development.
Stephen, how do you change laws in the U.S. in terms of tax reform, but also coincide with the international laws that we see? I mean, isn't that an issue when, for example, you look at the banks? They're following the regulatory environments in the U.S., but they've got a whole different set in Europe and Asia.
Well, I mean, I'd say that's an issue, but I'd say the primary issue is focusing on things here, and that's what we're going to do with. So tax reform will be our #1 priority. Regulations will be #2. Wilbur and I will work very closely together on trade, since trade crosses over both commerce and Treasury. We're going to look at a large infrastructure program and how we fund that, and look at many other aspects and things we need to get done.
Yeah, let's talk about the infrastructure program, because that's where there is some debate in terms of the cost. Are you expecting to be spending $1 trillion on infrastructure?
Well, first of all, let me just say, I think we're going to look very clearly at what we need to spend. But infrastructure is a priority for the president-elect. We need to make sure that the bridges and roads, that the power grids, that we have a 21st century infrastructure. And we'll be looking at many ways of doing it. Some of them will be private-public partnerships. Some of it will be working with the states. But we'll be looking at a lot of different things and ways to fund this so that it doesn't balloon the deficit.
And that's a job creator, you have to believe.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very labor-intensive, and it's very labor-intensive at high-paying job levels. So infrastructure is a very big deal. And as you know, we put forward one of the tools, a private-public partnership involving some tax credits that would be self-financing, because the taxes on the wages of the people completing the infrastructure and the profits of the companies building it will more than offset the tax credits to investors. So that's one other tool.
Whether it's infrastructure or the Keystone XL pipeline,
Right.
Trump campaigned on this platform of bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Your firm is credited with purchasing bankrupt companies, rehabilitating them.
Right.
Talk to us about that, because how do you formulate a policy that will, in fact, create those manufacturing jobs?
Well, all you have to do is change the environment. If we have fair ground rules in terms of international trade, if we have proper economic incentives within the U.S. and don't have an overly taxed system, it's not going to be that hard. Think about it. Reducing the marginal tax rate from 35% to 15% means that you have now 85% carry down of pre-tax to post versus 65%. That's a 30% increase. So any given capital expenditure now will make a 30% higher rate of return post-tax than it would have. That's enormous. Second, the ability to write off the capital investment itself is very good from a cash flow point of view. So both from a reported earnings point of view and a cash flow point of view, investing here is infinitely more attractive than it would have been before. And you know what? Most businessmen can add and subtract pretty well.
Which is why the air conditioning company Carrier is making its move. In fact, they tweeted out yesterday, "We are pleased to have reached a deal with President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Mike Pence to keep close to 1,000 jobs in Indiana. More details soon." Details on the agreement not available, but Carrier executives met with Trump yesterday to hash out a deal. What is the incentive other than these lower taxes, Stephen?
Well, let me first comment, and again, the great thing about this administration is you have a president and a vice president-elect that are willing to listen to business. Sometimes they'll agree and sometimes they won't agree, but they're going to listen and they're going to reach out. So in this case, you had calls to the CEO of United Technologies making it very clear we wanted to keep these jobs here, and they were very open to it. And I think you see this, and the details will come out, but this is just one of the many things. So we're glad they made our job easy, getting a quick win before we even got announced.
Tell me about it. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary to see these companies getting in line even before the inauguration.
Well, there's a big difference. This president is trying.
Yes.
Trying. That's a big difference.
And the past 8 years, there was just an ideology that it just doesn't work, or what?
I don't know of a single time.
I mean, I scratched my head to see why we haven't done this, which is why I asked you earlier. How come it's taken so long?
With all the jobs that have left, I don't think there's one recorded incident of the prior president calling the CEO and trying to reverse the decision.
Right. Well, he's still the president for a couple more weeks, so let's he's not the prior yet. Stephen, let's talk about taxes for a moment, because there was some debate. We had Steve Moore on the program recently who made a comment that maybe corporate tax is going to 15% is a priority, but maybe individual taxes coming down significantly is not as much of a priority, or maybe should not be. Where do you sit on this?
Absolutely not. They're both a priority. They're both going to be part of the tax bill that we pass. And we absolutely think that not only are corporate taxes important, but simplifying personal taxes, cutting the number of brackets down, creating a middle-income tax cut, incorporating the child care credits. This is all a huge priority. And on the upper class, we're going to simplify it. We're not going to have a tax cut for the upper class, but we are going to simplify it, and any reduction in the rate will be offset with less deductions and simplifying taxes. So we create a lower marginal rate for people to invest. But both the personal income tax and the corporate tax are part of the Trump plan, and that's going to be what we're looking to pass in the first 90 days.
Are you ready for a change in culture? I mean, you're both business guys and have been your entire careers. You're about to become, I don't know, dare I say, government bureaucrats?
Well, I think we'll have to change some, but I think that the president-elect is going to bring a slightly different culture to Washington, and I think the government bureaucrats will have to get used to us, and we'll have to get used to them.
Maybe there won't be government bureaucrats.
No, there are
with
more
the new sheriff in town.
There are more of them, but we think it's a fair fight.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, we had Steve Forbes on the other day, and he was talking about 6% economic growth. Is that in the realm?
Well, look, I'd love to have 6% economic growth, and I hope he's right. We're shooting to 3 to 4%, which we think is a sustainable long-term growth for this country, and that's where we think we're going to get. And if we can have 3 to 4% growth, that's fantastic for the United States.
How significant are you expecting to move the needle as it relates to money coming back from overseas? How much money is sitting overseas right now? We're talking, what, $2 trillion or something? Or
it's a staggering number.
It's a staggering number.
I mean, first of all, the reason why American companies don't bring the cash back is because the differential in tax rates. So the combination of lowering the corporate tax and a one-time 10% repatriation tax, absolutely going to get cash back here. I mean, if you look at Apple, Apple's kind of the classic company. They're sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars of cash, and they go out and borrow money against their overseas bank accounts. This makes no sense, and they've said the reason why they're doing that is because of like high corporate tax rates. So we think there's going to be hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars that's going to come back, and that's going to create infrastructure and create jobs.
Well, it makes no sense on one level, but it makes a lot of sense on another level because you've got 0% interest rates.
Right, but you already have Apple talking about now bringing factories back.
I love it.
Did you hear that last year or the year before?
No. Yeah,
now you're hearing it.
Exactly. On the topic of interest rates, what do you want to see happen at the Federal Reserve?
Well, first thing is we do have two positions that we have to fill at the Federal Reserve, two governors. One of the very important jobs is a vice chair of bank supervision. That has been open for a while, and that will be a big priority of the administration's to recommend someone to Congress to pass. And I think that, interest rates are going to stay pretty low for some period of time. Eventually, they're going to go up. We're going to need to look at how we extend the government debt so that when it goes up, we're not exposed to a huge increase in the deficit. But these are all the types of things we're going to look at. But the Fed jobs are two of the important ones we're looking at now.
When do you expect those decisions to be made? Next year?
We got a lot of jobs that we're looking at right now, and we're interviewing a lot of people, and we hope to make these decisions as quick as we can.
Are you hoping to fill these jobs with business people or a mix? How do you see filling out the staff?
Well, the key is going to be qualified people. And some may have prior government experience, some may not. But government experience is not the be-all and end-all, as Steve and I are going to try to prove.
Right, sure. I mean, you want a business person in there, right? I mean, more than not, who's actually handled the P&L, who's handled jobs and creating jobs.
And businesses have had a big history having to deal with government as well. So it isn't that if you've been in business, you don't have any interaction with government. You have altogether too much interaction, a lot of it involuntarily.
We've spoken a lot on this program about Obamacare and about the cost of the Affordable Care Act. Is this something that you're going to be tackling?
It's something I'll be working with the other parts of the administration on, and they'll be taking the lead on. But Obamacare is right up there as one of the top priorities of this administration to repeal and replace. Because
the rollback of regulations you think is going to be meaningful in terms of economic growth. Changes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the EPA, what are the other onerous regulations that you're looking to change?
I mean, I can tell you I've already started interviewing people for the EPA. I've sat in. This is one of the top priorities of this administration. We have a team of about 8 people that are interviewing. We're looking at that. We're looking at the SEC. There's a lot of things across of important government agencies where we need to put smart people in, and these people will have relevant experience to go in and know how to manage these agencies.
And obviously you've experienced the EPA rules better than most people out there. Can you characterize the impact?
Well, I believe that the total burden of regulation on this country is around $2 trillion a year. So if we could just knock out 10% of that, which should not be very hard, that's $200 billion a year pre-tax for corporations. That, at the 15% rate, that's $170 billion after tax. That's huge.
It's absolutely huge, yeah. So the EPA has been, and President Obama put a lot of those rules in the last 2 years.
Oh, yeah. There were something like 3,000 a year in each of the last 2 years. Now, do you really think the U.S. was such a wild and woolly place 2 years ago that we needed 6,000 or 7,000 more regulations? I don't think
it's
so.
Pretty incredible, actually.
That's a lot.
Take us behind the curtain, gentlemen, and tell us how these picks have gone on and the meetings that you've been having in terms of putting the administration together.
Well, I mean, let me first comment. I mean, I think this is just incredible. I mean, the president-elect himself, I think, has interviewed close to 70 people for critical jobs. And that's just him and a small group of people. And we have other teams below him that are interviewing. We've had a huge number of people that have come out and want to be part of this administration. I think the most incredible thing is we have a lot of people who didn't want to be part of the administration while he was running that now all of a sudden have changed their tune and want to support the president-elect. So we couldn't be more excited with the talent that we see both from the public and private sector that want to help serve this administration.
Yeah, I think there are more qualified people who want to help this administration than will be able to have jobs for.
So, I mean, I have to say to myself, well, where were they during the campaign? I mean, no large corporate CEO endorsed Donald Trump. Not one.
Well, you'd really have to ask them why, not us. We did.
I mean, it's almost, I mean, they should also be saying to themselves, what am I thinking that I just impacted shareholders? I mean, look how the market has reacted.
Right.
Where were they when all of the fighting was going on? I mean, really.
Well, Maria, you're right. The one thing I would comment is, although we didn't have large CEOs, we had a lot of small and medium size.
Yeah.
We had over 100 small and medium-sized CEOs that signed on to our economic plan in the letter. And look, I think we see this was an election about the American worker that supported this administration. And this was driven by small and medium businesses and business owners.
So what about the technology sector where they're saying, look, we want cheap labor?
Well, the technology sector is not that labor intensive anymore. Think about it. It's intellectual resource intensive more than it is labor intensive.
Okay. Okay. What about Mitt Romney? A lot of debate about Mitt Romney.
Look, first of all, I just comment, it was unfortunate that during the election that Mitt didn't come out and support the president-elect, but I think it's terrific that he's now come out and been incredibly supportive, and they've had a lot of conversations. And I think it's incredible of this president-elect that he's open to reach out to the most talented people, wherever they are, and listen to them. And I think that's what we see.
Thoughts on Secretary of State position?
That's for the president to decide.
All right, gentlemen. Great to have you both on the program.
Thank you very much.
We so appreciate it. Stephen Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross joining us there, and we'll be right back.